The double doors of the trauma bay blew open at 11:42 on a Tuesday night, and the man they wheeled through them was dying in a way none of the 3 doctors on shift had ever seen. His skin had gone the color of old wax. His muscles twitched under his shirt like something alive was trying to escape from beneath the skin. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, pink and thin, and his pupils had shrunk to pinpricks so small they looked like they belonged to a doll instead of a grown man. Nobody in that room could tell what was killing him. Nobody except the nurse standing quietly by the supply cart, a woman most of the staff barely noticed on a good day, the one who restocked gauze and checked vitals and said almost nothing during rounds. They thought she was just a nurse. They were dead wrong. Her name was Mara Voss, and for 6 years she had worked the night shift at Ashford Memorial with the kind of unglamorous consistency that made her invisible to everyone around her. She started intravenous lines faster than anyone on staff, calculated drug dosages in her head while sprinting down a hallway, and had a way of steadying frightened patients with nothing but the low, even cadence of her voice. The other nurses respected her. The doctors, for the most part, simply used her, the way one uses a good tool without ever wondering how it was forged. She was not a large woman, and she carried herself with a stillness that some mistook for meekness. Her hands were small and precise, her eyes a pale, watchful grey that seemed to catalogue a room the instant she entered it, counting exits, counting bodies, counting threats out of a habit she never spoke of. When chaos erupted around her, and in a level 1 trauma center chaos erupted often, Mara did not flinch or freeze or raise her voice. She simply narrowed her focus and went to work, the way a surgeon narrows a field before the first incision. There was a scar that ran along the inside of her left forearm, pale and old, shaped like a lightning bolt frozen mid-strike. When anyone asked about it, and few ever did, she gave the same flat answer every time. A car accident, years ago, back when she was young and reckless. It was a good story. It was also a lie, smooth and well-practiced, the kind of lie a person tells so many times that it starts to feel truer than the memory it was built to bury. There were other things, small things, that a careless observer would never connect into a pattern. The way she assessed a gunshot wound, not by asking what happened, but by immediately identifying caliber and trajectory. The way her hands did not shake when she packed an arterial bleed, not once, not ever, even when residents twice her rank went pale and had to look away. The way she once glanced at a young trauma surgeon's improperly staged rifle round on a radiograph and murmured, almost to herself, that the fragmentation pattern suggested a 5.56 round tumbling on impact, before catching herself and falling silent again. Nobody had asked how a nurse from a quiet suburban hospital would know a detail like that. Nobody had thought to ask. Dr. Preston Cole thought he was the smartest man in any room he occupied, and at Ashford Memorial, most nights, he was rarely challenged on the assumption. He had trained at a prestigious program, wore his white coat like a uniform of conquest, and treated the nursing staff the way a general might treat conscripts, useful bodies to be directed, never consulted. He was, by every metric that mattered to him, successful. He was also, underneath the polish, a coward who valued his reputation over the well-being of the people trembling on his tables, and who bristled with fury whenever anyone beneath his station dared to speak before being spoken to. It was Cole who took charge of the unidentified man the moment the paramedics rolled him in, rattling off a differential in a voice pitched for an audience rather than a patient. "Opioid overdose," he announced, noting the pinpoint pupils and depressed breathing, and ordered a dose of naloxone before he had even finished his sentence. 2 residents flanked him, nodding along like students eager to please a professor, neither of them pausing to ask why an overdose victim would also be seizing, drooling, and fasciculating like a man wired to a faulty current. Mara stood at the edge of the bay, watching the monitor. watching the man's chest hitch in shallow, wet gasps, and felt something cold settle into her stomach, a recognition she had not expected to feel again in this lifetime. The symptoms were not subtle to her. She had seen them before, years ago and an ocean away, in a place she did not let herself think about during daylight hours. This was not an overdose. This was cholinergic poisoning, the unmistakable signature of a nerve agent. And the naloxone in that syringe was about to do nothing but waste time the man did not have. She stepped forward and spoke, and her voice, though quiet, carried the particular calm of someone who has said hard things in worse rooms than this one. She told them the naloxone would fail. She told them this was not an overdose, but poisoning, likely organophosphate or nerve agent exposure, and that what he needed was atropine, immediately, in doses far beyond anything listed on a standard chart, along with an oxime to reactivate the enzymes the toxin had shut down. The bay went quiet for exactly 1 beat before it filled with laughter. Cole laughed first, a short, sharp bark that had no warmth in it at all, and the 2 residents followed a half-second behind him like dogs picking up a scent. He turned to her with an expression somewhere between amusement and contempt, the look of a man swatting away an insect he found more annoying than threatening. He told her, in a tone that made the words sting harder than they should have, that this was a hospital, not a battlefield, and that nurses restocked supplies, they did not diagnose patients. He told her to return to her cart before she embarrassed herself further. Mara did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply said, once more and without heat, that the man on the table had perhaps 20 minutes before his lungs stopped working entirely, and that the naloxone would buy them nothing. Cole's amusement evaporated into something uglier. He informed her, loudly enough for the entire bay to hear, that if she said one more word out of turn, he would have her written up for insubordination and escorted off the floor. And he reminded her, with the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed reminding people of their place, that her job existed at his pleasure and could end just as easily. The naloxone went in. Nothing changed. The man's oxygen saturation dropped another 4 points, and his heart rate, already climbing dangerously, began to stutter into an irregular rhythm on the monitor. 2 minutes later, when the naloxone had done precisely nothing, Cole did not admit error. He doubled the dose instead, his jaw tight, his pride now more invested in being right than his patient was invested in staying alive. Mara watched the second dose go in, and watched the man's fasciculations worsen. Small tremors rippling across his shoulders and jaw, his airway filling with secretions his own body could no longer clear. She stepped forward again, this time reaching for the crash cart, and a security guard, summoned by a glance from one of the residents, took her by the arm and began walking her toward the door. She did not resist. That, too, was a kind of discipline. The discipline of a woman who understood that a fight in the wrong moment could cost more than the fight itself was worth. She let herself be walked toward the exit, her eyes never leaving the monitor over the guard's shoulder, watching the numbers fall the way a soldier watches a fuse burn down towards something that cannot be stopped once it reaches the end. The alarm screamed less than 90 seconds later. The man's heart, overwhelmed by a toxin nobody in that room but Mara understood, slipped into ventricular fibrillation, and the monitor's flat-line tone cut through the bay like a blade. Cole shouted for the defibrillator. A resident began compressions, counting aloud in a voice gone thin with panic. The second resident fumbled with the crash cart, and somewhere in the scramble, the calm authority Cole had worn like armor cracked into something closer to raw fear, because he understood, in the pit of his stomach, that whatever he had done in the last 4 minutes had not been enough and might have made things worse. Mara stopped walking. The security guard's hand was still on her arm when she turned back toward the bay, and something in her face had changed. A stillness that was no longer passive but coiled, purposeful, the look of a woman setting down a mask she had worn for 6 quiet years. She pulled her arm free with a motion so smooth and economical the guard barely registered it happening until his grip was simply empty. She walked back into the trauma bay like she had never left it. She reached the supply cart and, in one motion, pulled a small canvas bag from the lowest shelf, a bag none of the staff had ever paid attention to because it looked like nothing more than a spare kit for her own medications. It was not. Inside were auto-injectors she had carried, unnoticed, in her locker for 6 years, atropine and pralidoxime in concentrations no civilian pharmacy would have stocked, remnants of a life she had told herself she would never need again. Her hands moved with a precision that made the frantic activity around her look clumsy by comparison. She did not ask permission. She simply acted, injecting a first dose of atropine directly into the intravenous line already running, calling out the dosage in a voice suddenly stripped of all softness, a voice built for cutting through noise and chaos and being obeyed. 2 milligrams, she said, then 4. Then she told the resident performing compressions to keep going, to not stop, that stopping now would kill him faster than the poison would. Cole started to object, his mouth opening to reassert control of a room that had just been taken from him. But the words died when Mara turned her head and looked at him, just once, with an expression that made something in his chest go cold. It was not anger in her eyes, it was certainty, the kind that comes only from having done this exact thing before in far worse conditions, with far less time. She stripped the man's shirt away in 2 sharp motions and began scrubbing his skin with decontamination solution, working in efficient, practiced sweeps from his neck down to his forearms, because she knew, the way only someone who had trained for chemical exposure would know, that whatever agent was on him was still being absorbed through his skin, and that no amount of atropine would matter if the poisoning did not stop first. She called for a second line, larger bore, and threaded it herself before anyone else could move, her fingers finding the vein on the first attempt, despite the tremor still running through the man's arm. She administered the pralidoxime, timing it against the atropine with an internal clock that seemed to know exact minutes without needing to look at anything. She suctioned his airway clear of the thick secretions drowning him from the inside, and when his jaw locked from the seizing muscle, she used a bite block she pulled from her own pocket, a tool no standard nursing kit at Ashford Memorial had ever included. The room had gone silent, except for the rhythmic count of compressions and the low hiss of the oxygen line, and every set of eyes, Cole's included, was locked on the woman they had laughed out of the room 90 seconds earlier. Mara called for the defibrillator herself, set the charge, and delivered it with a calm, single word of command that cleared the table without her having to raise her voice. The shock rolled through the man's body. The monitor held its flat, ugly line for a moment that felt endless to everyone watching. Then, jagged and uneven at first, a rhythm returned. She did not celebrate, she simply kept working, adjusting the ventilation rate on the bag valve mask with small, controlled squeezes, watching his oxygen saturation climb back into numbers that meant survival instead of catastrophe, monitoring his pupils as they slowly widened from the pinpoints they had been locked into. 10 minutes after she had walked back through those doors, the man who had been minutes from death was breathing on his own, his heart beating in a rhythm that, while still fragile, was undeniably alive. Nobody in the trauma bay spoke. The 2 residents stood frozen at the foot of the table, their earlier laughter now a memory that felt obscene in the silence that followed it. Cole stood with his arms slack at his sides, his expression the particular blankness of a man watching his entire understanding of a situation collapse in real time. The security guard who had walked her toward the door now stood near the wall, uncertain whether he was meant to apologize or simply disappear. It was into this silence, less than 8 minutes later, that the black sedans arrived. 3 of them pulled into the ambulance bay outside with a discipline that no civilian vehicle ever displayed, tires stopping in perfect unison, doors opening before the engines had fully died. 6 men in dark suits moved through the emergency entrance with the coordinated efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of arrival, fanning out to secure hallways and doorways with a quiet, practiced authority that made hospital security step back without being told to. At the center of them walked a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with silver hair cropped close to his skull and eyes that swept every room he entered like a searchlight. He carried no visible weapon, needed none, because everything about his presence, from his posture to the way the suited men around him deferred to him without a word, announced that he was the kind of man whose orders were never questioned twice. He introduced himself to the charge nurse only long enough to state that he was the station chief for a federal intelligence service, and that the man on table 4 was, as of this moment, under the protection of the United States government, and that anyone in this building who discussed what they had witnessed tonight outside of these walls would find themselves the subject of a very unpleasant conversation. It was not a threat delivered with heat. It was a fact, stated the way one states the weather. He moved through the trauma bay with the same searchlight gaze until it landed on Mara, and there, for the first time since he had walked through the doors, something in his expression shifted. He stopped walking. He stared at her for a long moment, the kind of stare that belongs to a man recalculating an entire situation in the space of a heartbeat. And then he said a name that had not been spoken aloud in that hospital in 6 years. A name that was not the one printed on her employee badge. He called her Master Sergeant Voss. The words landed in the trauma bay like a detonation. Cole's head snapped toward her. The residents exchanged a look of pure disbelief. Mara did not answer immediately. She simply straightened, almost imperceptibly. The posture of a soldier called to attention by a voice she had not expected to hear again. And something in her pale gray eyes, something tired and old and carrying more grief than anyone in that room could have guessed, surfaced for just a moment before she pushed it back down. The station chief, whose name was Marcus Hale, did not wait for an invitation to explain himself. He turned to the room, to Cole and the residents and the nurses gathered near the doorway, and he spoke in the booming, declarative cadence of a man used to delivering pronouncements rather than having conversations. He told them that the woman standing before them had once served as a combat medic attached to a classified special operations detachment, one of the few women ever cleared to operate embedded with a Tier 1 unit, and that she had spent 4 years in some of the most brutal theaters of an unnamed conflict, keeping operators alive in conditions that would have broken most trauma teams working in this very hospital. He told them that her file, most of which remained sealed to this day, documented 11 confirmed saves performed under direct enemy fire, extractions where she had continued treating the wounded while rounds struck the ground inches from her knees. He told them about a compound in a valley whose name he would not say aloud, an ambush that had taken the lives of 4 operators and left 3 more critically wounded, and how Master Sergeant Voss had held that position for 11 hours, alone with the wounded, using a field kit and sheer will to keep 3 men breathing until an extraction team could break through. He told them that the scar on her forearm, the one she called a car accident, was in fact shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade that had detonated close enough to kill anyone standing where she had chosen to stand, directly over a wounded soldier, shielding his body with her own. He told them, and his voice dropped here, quieter but no less commanding, that the man now stabilized on table 4, the man whose life she had just saved for the second time in his existence, was the same soldier she had shielded that day in the valley, a man who had gone on to become one of the agency's most valuable field operatives, specifically because a young medic had refused to let him die when everyone else had already written him off. The silence that followed was total. Cole's face had drained of color entirely, and the confident posture he had worn like a second white coat all night had collapsed into something small and uncertain. He opened his mouth once, as though to offer some explanation, some defense of the decisions he had made, and found that he had nothing that would survive being spoken aloud in that room. Hale did not spare him the humiliation. He turned to Cole directly and asked, in a voice that filled the entire bay, whether it was standard protocol at this hospital to physically remove a trained combat medic from a dying patient's side because her diagnosis had wounded a doctor's ego. He asked whether Cole understood how close his stubbornness had come to costing the life of a federal operative, and whether he understood that the report of tonight's events would be reaching the hospital's board, the state medical licensing authority, and a federal oversight committee before sunrise. Cole said nothing. There was nothing to say. His career, built so carefully on the appearance of competence, was already unraveling in real time in front of the very staff who had once deferred to him without question. Within the week, the consequences fell exactly where they were promised. The hospital board suspended Cole, pending a full investigation into medical negligence, the kind of formal proceeding that ends careers rather than pauses them. The state board opened its own inquiry after the federal report landed on their desk with an urgency no ordinary complaint ever carried. The residents who had laughed alongside him found their names attached to statements they would spend years trying to explain away, their early confidence replaced by the particular caution of people who had learned, in the worst possible way, that certainty is not the same as being right. The nurses who had spent 6 years walking past Mara Voss without truly seeing her now looked at her the way one looks at a monument they had mistaken for scenery. There was no gloating in her expression when they approached her that night, no satisfaction in having been proven right in front of the men who had humiliated her. There was only the same quiet stillness she had always carried, though something in it had loosened slightly, as though a weight she had held alone for 6 years had finally been witnessed by someone else. Marcus Hale did not rush her. He waited until the operative on table 4 had been stabilized for transport, until the federal medical team had arrived to take over his care, and only then did he approach her again, this time with none of the booming authority he had used on Cole, speaking instead in the low, respectful tone of a man addressing someone he considered, in every way that mattered, his equal. He told her the agency had spent years trying to locate her after she left the service without a forwarding address, that there were people in Washington who still spoke about the valley and the medic who had held it, and that if she ever wanted a way back into a life that used her fully, instead of asking her to hide half of who she was, the door would be open. He placed a small card into her hand, plain and white, containing nothing but a phone number with no name attached to it, the kind of card that only exists for people trusted to know exactly what it means. Mara looked at the card for a long moment, turning it once between her fingers, the way a person turns over a decision rather than an object. She did not answer him immediately, and Hale, to his credit, did not push her for one. He simply nodded, the gesture of a man who understood that some doors are meant to be left open rather than walked through immediately, and told her that the number would reach him directly, day or night, whenever she was ready. She walked with him as far as the ambulance bay when the transport team wheeled the operative out toward a waiting medical helicopter, its rotors already beginning to spin against the night sky, throwing harsh white light across the pavement. Before he was loaded aboard, the man she had saved twice in one lifetime reached out and caught her wrist with what strength he had left. And though he could not yet speak clearly through the tube still taped along his jaw, his eyes said everything that needed saying. She squeezed his hand once, briefly, and let him go. She did not leave with the convoy that night. She returned instead to the nurse's station, finished the charting on a patient whose real name she still did not know, and clocked out at the end of her shift, exactly as she always had, without ceremony, without announcement, carrying the plain white card folded into the pocket of her scrubs, like a question she was not yet ready to answer. What happened in that trauma bay was never explained to most of the staff who had witnessed it, and the story that circulated through the hospital in the weeks that followed grew and shifted the way stories do when the truth is stranger than anyone quite believes. But the lesson of it settled into that building regardless, quiet and permanent, the way certain lessons do once they have been paid for in full. The lesson was simple, though it had cost a great deal to teach. The people who seem the most ordinary are sometimes carrying the heaviest histories, and the ones who speak the least softly are often the ones who have earned the right to speak the loudest, if only anyone had bothered to listen the first time. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for the quiet woman nobody thought to trust, then take a moment and hit that like button, because stories about hidden strength deserve to be seen. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that competence rarely announces itself. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like hers, ordinary people carrying extraordinary pasts, waiting for the moment the world finally sees them clearly. And before you go, drop a comment and tell us what you would have done in that trauma bay, whether you would have laughed with the doctors or listened to the nurse. We will see you in the next story. In the weeks that followed, the story of that night did not fade so much as it settled into the marrow of Ashford Memorial, becoming something the staff spoke of only in lowered voices, the way people speak of events too large to fit into ordinary conversation. The federal report that arrived at the hospital administrator's office was thick and redacted in places, black bars swallowing entire paragraphs. But what remained visible was enough to end any lingering doubt about what had happened on Table 4. Dr. Cole's suspension became permanent before the month was out, his name quietly removed from the surgical roster, his office cleared of its diplomas and awards by an assistant who would not meet his eyes while doing it. He tried for a time to frame himself as the victim of an impossible situation, a man who could not have known what he was facing. But the transcripts of his own words, recorded on hallway cameras and repeated by 3 separate witnesses, told a different story, one that no amount of polish could soften. Mara did not attend the disciplinary hearings, though she was asked to submit a statement, which she did, in the same flat, economical language she used for everything else, stripped of anger, stripped of vindication, containing only what had happened and when. She did not read about the outcome in any newspaper, because there was no newspaper article to read. The agency had seen to that, with the same quiet efficiency it used to erase so many other things. What remained was simply the truth, as it existed inside the walls of that hospital, passed from nurse to nurse in careful whispers, growing a little more legendary with each retelling, though none of the versions that circulated ever came close to matching what she had actually done. She kept working the night shift. That surprised some of the newer staff, the ones who had heard the story secondhand and expected her to vanish into whatever shadowed world Marcus Hale had offered her, expected her to reappear on the news someday under a different name entirely. Instead, she showed up at 11 each night in the same worn sneakers, restocked the same supply carts, checked the same vitals with the same unhurried patience she always had. The difference, subtle but unmistakable, was in how the room moved around her now. Doctors who had once spoken over her began pausing before giving orders in her presence, watching her face for some flicker of disagreement before committing to a plan. Residents who had laughed found reasons to ask her opinion quietly, in corners, when no one else was listening, unwilling to repeat the mistake that had cost a man his career. She kept the white card in a drawer at home, beneath a stack of folded shirts, for the better part of 2 months. She did not call the number, not because she had decided against it, but because some decisions require a person to sit with silence before they can be made honestly. Some nights, after her shift ended and the sky outside had gone the pale grey of early morning, She would sit at her kitchen table with the card in front of her and think about the valley, about the 11 hours she had spent with her hands pressed into wounds that would not stop bleeding, about the men she had saved and the one she had not been able to. She thought about the version of herself that had existed before all of that, a younger woman who had believed medicine was a clean and simple calling, untouched by war. She was no longer that woman, and she had made a kind of peace with the fact that she never would be again. What she came to understand, sitting alone in that quiet kitchen, was that she had not left her old life behind when she left the service. She had only buried it, the way a person buries something valuable during a storm, intending to dig it up again once the weather clears, and never quite finding the courage to return to the spot. The trauma bay had forced the excavation whether she was ready or not, and now that the ground had been broken open, there was no sealing it shut again. She was, and had always been, both women at once. The gentle nurse who spoke softly to frightened children, and the soldier who had held a valley together with nothing but atropine and sheer will. Pretending otherwise had cost her something over the years, a kind of quiet exhaustion she had mistaken for simple tiredness, and she was only now beginning to understand how heavy that pretending had been. On a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, she finally dialed the number on the card. Marcus Hale answered on the second ring, as though he had been waiting for the call for months without ever once doubting it would come. And their conversation lasted only a few minutes, brief and businesslike in the way conversations between professionals tend to be. She did not commit to anything permanent that day. She agreed only to a meeting, a single conversation in a windowless room somewhere in Washington, to hear what the agency actually had in mind. It was a small step, but it was a step taken with open eyes, not the reluctant compliance of a woman being pulled back into a life she resented, but the deliberate choice of someone finally willing to stop dividing herself in half.